Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Mike Duffy, VP of Product and Innovation at Grasp. I'll be your moderator for this session. We have an expert panel with us today to talk about something that frankly keeps a lot of the finance and travel managers up at night, and that's payment fraud in corporate travel. Specifically, we're going to be talking about how single-use virtual cards eliminate that exposure in many ways that traditional corporate cards simply can't match. This is not an intro to virtual cards. We're assuming you have a base knowledge. Today is more about fraud. So let's get into it. Let's start by talking about who's joining in the call. First, Katie is an account executive at Grasp, working directly with TMCs and corporate clients on virtual card benefits every day. Katie, great to have you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Happy to be here.
Next is Louise Yopi. He's an advisor to Grasp, working with companies on payments strategy and virtual card adoption. Louise, welcome.
Hello.
And finally, Rene Gracioso, or I probably butchered that, so I apologize. And she is the value-added services fraud product manager at MasterCard. Welcome.
Hi, Mike. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invite. Always happy to talk about how we can minimize the risk of fraud across these flows.
Great.
So yeah, very excited about today.
So here's our agenda today. We're starting off with the foundations, and then walking through the processes and issues as well as the trends that's happening today and the payments and around fraud. But before we get into virtual cards, how they solve the problem, I want to ground everyone in the current fraud landscape. I find it's always helpful to see the numbers and sort of what makes up those numbers. And I find a lot of these numbers, quite surprising. Whether it's, the number of hospitality breaches, a result of saying ransomware. The one I found quite interesting too is the, average time to detect a breach. And so, that there's certainly a lot of great information there, but there's also a qualitative or part of this that's not said here. Every traveler carrying a traditional card is a potential exposure point for the company, for the corporate. And then fraud disputes, when they do happen, they're expensive, time consuming, and they could potentially disrupt the traveler as they're traveling as well. So Rene, from MasterCard's vantage point, what are we actually seeing in corporate travel payments now?
Yeah, sure. So from a fraud perspective, we see different patterns impacting fraud trends in the travel industry. So I guess there's three main high-level patterns that we can discuss today. The way cards are being shared, the way the cards are being stored, and then how operational complexity around travel can help some fraudsters in their innovating ways of compromising cards. So the ways card of being shared. So you have, as you know, you have multiple players around the chain. You might have booking engines, travel managers, and many other players that might get hold of the card details. So the more players or parties are involved in the chain, the more opportunities for fraud vulnerabilities or fraud scenarios where cards can be compromised. The other point is where cards are being stored and how they are being stored. As you know, there's a long time between when the trip is booked and when the card is actually charged with some of the merchants. So that also gives some potential risks in terms of data breaches, cards being compromised, etc. And last but not least, you have some operational complexity as part of that. Travel has, as you know, amendments, cancellations, incidentals, etc., etc. So any gap between that intended purpose of the trip and what the card is created for, and between what actually happens and settles, is where there some vulnerabilities can be exploited.
Okay. Yeah, I see. So there could be a variety of ways that could be exploited, as you mentioned. So, Louise, from advisory perspective, when you're talking to corporations about fraud risk, where do you see the biggest blind spots?
Mostly, and just following up on what Irene was just explaining, is the lack sometimes of visibility or understanding at the CFO level or controller level in an organization of the details of the workflow and the journey that the credit card information have to follow in this indirect payment system that we have in the travel industry, in not understanding how many times a car number is replicated in different systems, and the fact that they are exposing, for example, if they are not using virtual cards, they are exposing real car numbers, either a central travel account or actual plastic. With all this information and with a large open to buy amount or line of credit, and the risk that represent for the organization and how difficult and painful it is to identify fraud when you have hundreds of thousands of transactions on real cards, and being able to dispute those charges or make sure the charges are legitimate.
Okay. Okay. And then so, let's get into some of the mechanics of that. Katie, what changes structurally when a company moves to, say, virtual cards?
Yeah, in my personal opinion, this is where virtual cards are really going to shift the game in travel. At a structural level, you're moving away from the broad, open-ended access to funds and you're replacing it with highly controlled transactions. So instead of one card being used over and over again, you're creating single use cards, which means each payment is going to be tied to a specific transaction. And then from there, you can add in layers of controls. For instance, merchant locked cards, so you can only it can only be used at a specific hotel or supplier. The amount cap, ensuring the charge can't exceed what was approved. Date restrictions, so the card can only be used during a defined window. Auto deactivation, so once the transaction is complete, the card's no longer active. So this really all adds up to an important shift of virtual cards convert the systemic risk into a transactional risk. So instead of exposing your entire program to potential misuse, you're isolating the risk down to a single controlled payment. And that's what gives companies not just more security, but a lot more control over their travel spend.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And so, we hear of the MCC controls quite often when it comes to the virtual cards. Can you explain those a little bit more in detail?
Yeah, the MCC code, it's going to stand for merchant category code. So every merchant is going to have one. Hotels are a specific MCC code. Airlines are different, car rental different again. So you're going to configure a virtual card to only work at merchants with the correct MCC code. So a hotel card can't be used at a retail store or a restaurant or for cash advance. It can only be used at an accommodation provider. So this is going to be incredibly powerful for a reconciliation and for limiting that fraud scope.
Got it. Got it. And, I see single versus multi on the screen there. I was wondering if we could dive into that a little bit further and what does that mean? And there's a fundamental choice, between that single use or multi-use. Can you tell us about that decision?
Yeah, it's one of the most common decisions clients make. So for a single use card, it's issued for one transaction. So once that transaction clears, that number is gone, which is going to maximize your security. In the residual exposure, a multi-use card can be charged multiple times within its configured parameters. So same card, same trip, multiple charges. It's slightly more exposed, but better for extended stays or situations where the merchant may charge multiple times, like a hotel that charges the room rate and a resort fee separately.
Okay. And within that, a single trip and it's multi-use, I'm looking at it's kind of like as a purpose, single purpose versus multi-purpose. Is there a distinction there?
Yeah, there is. So single purpose means the card's tied to one specific vendor or one specific transaction type. So think of it like a key. It can only be used to open one door. A multi-purpose card can work across multiple merchants or MCCs, but still within your defined parameters. The trade-off is always security versus flexibility, and that's where the next conversation gets a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, and you mentioned trade-off. So, Luis, you've seen this play out with clients. What's the right balance between that control and that user experience?
Well, that's where the role of the travel manager becomes critical. So once a corporation makes a decision or a company makes a decision to move into virtual cards, the implementation of the card is critical. And for the travel manager or travel managers, in the case of multi-countries, global or multinational implementations, is critical because they will have an understanding of the different travelers' profiles, from executives to guest travelers to contractors, for example, and you the deep understanding also of the travel policies, but also getting to learn from the vendor or the provider of virtual cards during the implementation process, the available controls, and being able to find that sweet spot that we have here on the left bucket, where you have an optimal configuration. If you have too many controls, like the red column on the right, and your controls are too tight, for example, where you have a credit card payment across borders, where actually because of the currency exchange fluctuations or other fees, you cannot really set up an amount control that is exact without any kind of tolerances. You will risk potential declines and a bad customer experience. You can create, for example, a tolerance where you allow, you issue the card for a particular amount control, but also allow a tolerance that could be a percentage or a dollar amount to have that wiggle room to make sure that the card doesn't get declined where you can figure out exactly what that amount will be, the final amount. If you're under control and you leave the controls too loose, then you're opening that card for potential fraudulent transactions. And sometimes it's not just fraud, maybe an unauthorized transaction, right? Where, for example, a traveler goes and upgrades to a suite and wants to charge it to the card. And then because the controls are too loose, you're allowing an unauthorized transaction. It's not fraud, maybe a violation of the corporate travel policy, but this will allow you not only to minimize the risk of exposing your card to fraud, but also to be able to control your travel policy.
Yeah, interesting. And that scenario could play. I mean, I've seen it too. Perhaps someone's changed departments where they may have had a more relaxed, spend, and they were okay. They were authorized to spend. Maybe they were in sales, and then they moved into a different position, and there was more controls. In which case, it simply becomes unauthorized. And like you said, it's not fraud. It's just unauthorized.
Well, the sales department will be a department. If I'm a travel manager, we're going to put tight controls because it's usually a department that cannot be trusted.
Or it can't be controlled. I think this, perhaps. Well, that's great. Thanks for that. And so just kind of thinking, switching gears for a moment, of a hypothetical example, more on the data breaches and that sort of thing. Maybe it's 2 a.m, somewhere a major hotel chain, their reservation database got compromised. Perhaps it contains millions of payment cards. And they get peered on the dark web marketplace. And so among those records, would be corporate cards of the travelers. And this isn't hypothetical. This does happen. Irene, could you walk us through, what would typically happen next?
Yeah, so I guess there's a predictable sequence here. Attackers start validating the card, testing the card with a small test transaction, seeing if they work, and then that will start scaling quickly to maybe different merchants, different regions even. And then when the companies are starting to learn that there's a fraud attack happening is when they start seeing the first sign of impact, right? Unexpected calls from the travelers, issuer alerts, and that's why it's so important to have that fraud strategy from the beginning in terms of what are the alerts that I'm going to have in place and what are the rules that I'm going to have in place when something like this happens. But also going back to that card's controls, how can I, or the best practice around matching the card to the intention on the card so that when this potentially happens, you already have all of those controls and you're preventing and minimizing the risk of a fraudulent attack. So shrinking the fraud surface possibilities is the most important thing here so that at the end, as Luis was saying before, you'll still have a smooth experience for your traveler and you won't have that long tail of dispute management, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, and Katie, how does that fit in with GrassPay?
Yeah, of course. So first, in most cases, the card has already expired. It was created for a specific stay within a specific date range, so by the time a breach even happens, that number's no longer usable. Second, there's no downstream exposure. That card wasn't tied to multiple transaction or reused across vendors. It was locked to a single booking. So instead of worrying about where else that card might be floating around, there's nowhere else for it to go. And third, there's no need for a broad reissue. You're not scrambling to replace cards across your entire program or notify dozens of employees or travelers. And lastly, there's no traveler disruption. So there's no need to cancel cards, update wallets, or impact any upcoming trips. So what could have been a large program-wide issue becomes a contained one-off event.
Okay. Okay, good to know. And I think that containment is an interesting word you just used there because, if we look at the challenge of what, in my opinion, the challenge of, that, and I think hinted on it earlier, on that distribution, the access and who has the card and what systems are getting the card. So where the card is exposed and finding, getting the right virtual card to the right person at the right time. Um, Louise, from your advisory work, what are the key questions clients need to answer about that distribution?
Well, who has access to the card? So when we are issuing real cards, plastic, and being distributed to employees, or a central travel account is lodged with a travel management company to book reservations, or with a travel department, who has access to those cards, uh, and uh, and how is that data protected? In the ecosystem of the travel industry, we have multiple um, systems that handle the payment, and the payment information, along with a lot of PII, personal identifiable information, travelers' names, and frequent guest numbers, frequent flyer numbers, a lot of confidential information that combined with the payment information becomes very dangerous and a high risk of identity theft and the ability to commit fraud. So it's extremely important to understand who has access to the card, what systems store that information, how is that information stored and controlled, and the important thing implementing this program is the validity and the timing of when the card will be issued, how far ahead of the trip, how far in advance. Of course, again, like we talked about before, the success of this implementation depends on the understanding of the controls available to the travel manager as the program is being implemented, and how do you use those controls? If sometimes we do need to book reservations way ahead of time. Airline tickets and hotel reservations in many cases are booked way ahead of the actual trip. So you have a longer period of exposure where that card is valid for an amount that is open to be charged. If you wait until closer to the trip, you're going to have the risk of the room not being available, the rates going up, or the airfares going up. So you have to be able to issue those cards at the right time, but also the expiration or the validity of the card. When do you want that virtual card to expire? A day, 2 days after the termination of the trip? If you make that card terminate on the day of the checkout, there's a risk that there may be charges that are valid charges, for example, breakfast, room service, parking charges that are valid and should go on the card. But if the card already expired, you're going to have a challenge. So this is all extremely important. And then matching the activation to the itinerary. The ability of the implementer of the virtual cards, in the case of, for example, GrassPay, we have the ability to, if there is a change in the reservation, to change and extend the validity of the card to match the new checkout date if the reservation was changed to, let's say, extend for 1 or 2 more nights.
Right, right. And so that timing, is pretty important. And so, Katie, what would be the best practice around that?
Yeah, a good rule of thumb that we recommend is 24 to 48 hours before check-in. If you go any earlier than that, you're creating an unnecessary exposure window. The card is live, but the traveler hasn't traveled yet. Any later, and you risk operational issues. The card hasn't hit the hotel system. The traveler can't find it when they need it at 3 a.m. in a different time zone. The activation window should also match the itinerary as closely as possible. Check-in date to checkout date plus 1 day buffer date for a late checkout or those incidental holds.
Okay. And so we do have a global audience here today. I just wanted to spend a few minutes on any regional differences. And so, Irene, how do fraud patterns and virtual card dynamics, vary across around the world?
Yeah, sure. I'll answer to that. I just wanted to add to the
Sure.
previous discussion just quickly.
Yeah.
I think the question that we should be asking ourselves always is how can I minimize the risk of fraud? So the controls piece that we've been discussing is key to that when you're generating your card program and the different virtual cards, but also the cybersecurity aspect of that. So when Luis and Katie are talking about these parties having access and how much is that card exposure, really understanding that adhering to the security standards ensures a strong cybersecurity that mitigate any types of data breach or vulnerabilities across the different systems. So what parties am I working with? What is their cybersecurity? Where are threats? And how can we work together to have less of those threats within the chain of the virtual card, right? So I think that's very key on top of the controls. And in MasterCard, we have a series of cybersecurity products that help you understand and monitor how the different parties behave in that sense. But yeah, now moving on to the markets and what behaviors do we see there? I think there's different regional trends, although there's some fraud patterns that you see across the globe, and more because of the nature of travel being so global. However, I think there's three main points here. The first one is around authentication and the regulatory pressure on strong customer authentication that you see, for example, in Europe, and you don't see so much in North America, and that does change. You might have some exemptions in secure corporate payments, for example, but that does change the behavior in how fraudsters work towards that fraud and cash out the money. The other piece that is, I think, very important to understand is the regional trends in terms of local acceptance and how merchants work in those regions. So you might have the conversation we were having around single-use cards, but you might have specific markets that actually charge per room. So it becomes that single-purpose card, but then the way the market behaves is the way you will set up your card program, and you will set up the controls for that to work in that specific market. At the end of the day, is the balance between acceptance and user experience and the controls. And then last but not least, I think it's very interesting to see how it differs depending on the region on virtual card familiarity and how the desk reception knows how to deal with a virtual card and how to store the information. You might see some of them even like printing card details to use it then to charge, whereas in other markets, there's more of a familiarity on potential threats, etc. So I think that does change or impact how virtual cards are seen and used. However, overall, as fraud patterns, I think they're pretty similar across the different regions.
Okay. Well, thanks for that and the additional clarity on the card distribution. That's great. I'll ask you a next question as well. I know internally we promised we'd be touching a little bit on the chargebacks as it's an important topic. And we'll keep it brief because we feel like it does deserve its own dedicated session. But Renee, could you tell us a little bit more on the complexity of chargebacks?
Yeah, sure. So, as you know, chargeback can get pretty complex, and I understand why you would want to do a next webinar or more of a deep dive because there's a lot of different questions and nuances, a lot of different types of chargeback, and the dispute management being a different and sometimes long process. Chargebacks can be, as we were saying, like pretty expensive, time consuming. At the end of the day, what we want is reduce all of that by preventing the fraud. But more in the travel space, you you have a long period. So you book the trip and then from the booking of the trip until the service is delivered, until a potential fraud has been seen, and then you start reporting and start the process. It could be really time consuming, and it might have other types of impacts in the different teams, like reconciliation, and then starting to have like all the right documentation, etc. So very important from the beginning to have that clear documentation around whoever is having traveled in, staying the night at a hotel, etc. And virtual cards can strengthen the position there.
Okay, great. And so, as mentioned, we'll cover the full chargeback picture in the future, and dispute processes, liability shift, protecting the cardholder, and then managing chargebacks at scale in an upcoming webinar. So watch out for that invitation. But lastly, let's talk about who feels the pain when things go wrong. Louise, from a finance and accounting perspective, what does a disputed virtual card transaction actually cost an organization?
Well, a virtual card eases the pain and reduces the cost of dealing with chargebacks or fraudulent transactions. The identifying an unauthorized transaction is much easier. Number one, because you have a one-to-one relationship between the card number that was issued for a particular trip, single use, multiple use for single trip, doesn't matter. So the card was issued for a traveler for this particular trip. We all know and experience that from our personal cards to corporate experience or business travel experience, that in many cases, the statement that we get back from our issuer doesn't have enough details to identify the transaction. You see a charge there, and sometimes you need to ask your spouse, your partner, your children, your employees, what is this charge for? Because it's not enough information. When you issue a virtual card, if you have a strong provider of solutions in the virtual card space, at the time of issuing the virtual card, data about that reservation is being captured and stored. So when the charges come through, all these details are associated with a card number. So it's a one-to-one, so that a 16-digit card number becomes a unique identifier that help you have all the data that you need to identify the transaction. When you have an unauthorized transaction and there is not enough data, you will quickly identify, okay, what is this card for? If they were able to put an unauthorized transaction, a virtual card use, you will be able to identify that quickly. In the case of using real cards, when you have multiple transactions, being an individual piece of plastic for an employee, a corporate card, a T&E card, or a central travel account, even worse, because you have thousands or hundreds of transactions at the minimum on a single account number. If you have a charge and you don't have details for that transaction, there's a lot of work from accounts payables, from the finance department, the office of the controller having to say, oh, this is a hotel transaction, go to the travel manager. Travel manager need to try to figure out who this transaction is for. Is it not enough information to contact the hotel, for example, try to get information about that. So all of that not only requires time, it takes time, but also requires tremendous amount of work by multiple people and multiple departments. And then once you identify that this transaction is fraudulent, you have to go back and do a chargeback, which is not an easy process. And you have to have documentation to really go back. And you need to give the merchant an opportunity to back up those charges and say this is an unauthorized transaction. So the merchant have to prove that those charges were valid. So there's a lot of time involved. You need to track it, and you need to get all kinds of documentation to be able to file a chargeback, and then follow up to make sure that that transaction is taken off your account.
Right. There's a lot of players there that's involved, and you know, this perspective on it. And I was wondering, Katie, can you tell us, you know, what would how does it look from a travel manager's point of view?
Yeah, here's an example of kind of what the nightmare might look like. You have a traveler that flies across the country for an important client meeting. They arrive at the hotel front desk. It's 11 p.m. They suffered a delayed flight. They're exhausted and they walk up to the front desk, and the hotel tells them that the virtual card on file was declined, therefore putting the reservation at risk. This happens when the card configuration wasn't quite right. Maybe the activation window ended too early, or the amount limit that was set below what the hotel required for the incidental hold. The MCC wasn't configured correctly for that particular property, and the traveler has no corporate card of record. So they're either going to put it on their own personal card and deal with a complex reimbursement on the back end, or they're calling their travel manager at midnight. So this is why we spend so much time on the configuration before cards go live.
Okay. Well, lots of good information there and throughout the presentation that I feel. And so I just wanted to give everyone, you know, some of the takeaways, you know, from our discussion. So, you know, single use equals zero exposure. You know, controls to match your profile, you know, whether it's the merchant category codes, the geography, the timing is quite important. So, you know, trying to issue or activate the cards at a very minimal time frame. And in terms of, you know, disputes, you know, the single purpose card offers a lot better documentation. So it provides a little bit of protection towards the chargeback scenario. And then always think of the traveler in mind, you know, make sure that the configuration is going to be optimal for them, so they don't have to sleep in the park bench and they get a comfortable night's sleep. Yeah, so that wraps it up for us. I'd like to thank our guest speakers. You know, it's an incredible panel that I have with us today. Irene, Katie, and Louise. Your expertise is greatly appreciated, and it was a fun chat we had all together. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who joined us as well today, listening in. And keep an eye out for our next webinar invitation where we're doing a deep dive on chargebacks. Until then, travel safely and configure those virtual cards. All right, thank you all. Well.